In 1975, a 24-year-old engineer named Steve Sasson built something that had never existed before. He worked at Kodak, the most powerful photography company in the world, and he had been given a loose assignment: see if you can do something useful with a new kind of image sensor called a CCD. He spent several months in his lab piecing together a device from spare Kodak parts, a movie camera lens, a cassette tape, and 16 batteries. What he ended up with was roughly the size of a toaster. It weighed 8 pounds. It took 23 seconds to capture a single black and white image. The resolution was so low that the image was barely recognizable. It was, also, without any question, the world's first digital camera. Sasson brought it to his managers. He showed them what it could do. He explained what it might become with more development. Their response, as Sasson later described it, was, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." The concern was simple. Kodak made most of its money selling film. A camera that didn't need film was not something Kodak wanted to exist, so the invention was quietly shelved. Sasson was told to keep it internal. The patent was filed and then mostly ignored. 27 years later, digital cameras made film cameras essentially obsolete. 37 years later, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. The company that invented digital photography went bankrupt because of digital photography. And the reason it happened was not bad luck, not bad timing, and not a technology that nobody saw coming. It was a series of choices made over decades by people who knew exactly what they were doing to protect what was profitable today instead of building what would survive tomorrow. This is Mismanaged. I'm Joseph. Every episode, we take a real organization, walk through the decisions that led to its failure, and pull out lessons that apply to the work most of us do every day. Today, we're focusing on Kodak, a company that had a 100-year head start, invented the technology that disrupted it, and still couldn't make the turn. George Eastman founded the Eastman Kodak Company in 1888 in Rochester, New York. Before Eastman, photography was not something ordinary people did. Cameras were large, fragile, and required complicated chemistry. Taking a photo meant hauling heavy glass plates, preparing chemical emulsions, and doing your own darkroom development. It was slow, expensive, and accessible only to professionals or very dedicated hobbyists. Eastman changed all of that with one key invention: roll film. Instead of glass plates, film came on a flexible roll that could be loaded into a small, simple camera. He paired this with a camera design so straightforward that anyone could use it, and a business model so clever that it reshaped an entire industry. The model worked like this: Kodak sold cameras at a low price, sometimes almost at cost, and made its real money on the film and the processing. Every roll of film a customer used, every photo they developed at a Kodak lab, was revenue that flowed back to the company. The camera was the entry point. The consumables were the business. This model had a famous tagline: "You press the button, we do the rest." It worked extraordinarily well. By the time the 20th century hit its stride, Kodak was one of the most recognized brands in the world. Photography had become a part of everyday life: birthdays, holidays, graduations, family vacations, and Kodak was the company that made it possible for ordinary families to capture those moments. The yellow Kodak box was as familiar as any brand on the planet. By 1976, a century after the company was founded, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of film sales in the United States and about 85% of camera sales. It employed more than 145,000 people worldwide, the majority of them in and around Rochester, New York. Rochester was, in a very real sense, a Kodak city. The company funded hospitals, universities, art institutions, and community programs. Entire neighborhoods existed because of Kodak jobs. The film business was not just successful, it was extraordinarily profitable. Gross margins on film regularly ran above 70%. Making and selling a roll of film cost very little relative to what people paid for it, and people bought film constantly. Birthdays, vacations, school plays, holidays, every occasion was a reason to load up a new roll. That profitability is the invisible engine running underneath everything that happens next. Because when you are making 70-cent profit on every dollar of revenue from a product millions of people buy every year, the idea of building something that would replace it is not just strategically uncomfortable, it feels financially insane. That tension between protecting what works today and building what works tomorrow is what this whole story is about. So the main characters are Steve Sasson, the engineer who invented the digital camera, a series of CEOs who wrestled with how to respond to digital photography, particularly George Fisher, who came closest to making the turn, and Antonio Perez, who tried a different direction and just couldn't pull it off, and the roughly 145,000 employees at peak who depended on the company. Over roughly 3 decades, Kodak watched the photography market shift from film to digital, made multiple attempts to adapt, and failed to fully commit to any of them, largely because the film business was so profitable that every dollar spent on digital felt like a threat to something that was already working. And the digital camera was invented in 1975. Kodak filed for bankruptcy in January 2012. The slow decline in between is what this story is about. And this took place in Rochester, New York, where Kodak was headquartered and where the human cost of the company's failure was most deeply felt. And since the film was a near perfect business, the margins were enormous. The demand was consistent, and Kodak's brand was so dominant that it had very little real competition. Transitioning to digital meant building a new business from scratch while simultaneously dismantling the most profitable one the company had ever had. Every time that choice came up, the film side of the company, which had the money, the power, and the most senior people, won. After Steve Sasson's digital camera was shelved in 1975, Kodak continued to thrive. The late 1970s and 1980s were very good years for the film business. Demand was strong, profits were high, and the company's market position felt unassailable. But the first warning shot came in 1981, when Sony released a product called the Mavica, an electronic camera that recorded images to a small magnetic disc instead of film. The Mavica was not, technically, true digital camera in the modern sense, but it was the first widely publicized demonstration that photography without film was not just theoretically possible, it was commercially real. Kodak's internal response was to commission a study. The study concluded that digital photography would eventually replace film, that the transition would likely take about 10 years, and that Kodak should start preparing. And the study sat on desks. The film business kept growing, the preparations moved slowly. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Kodak went through a period of unfocused expansion. It bought a pharmaceutical company, it moved into copiers and printers, it diversified into chemicals. Some of these moves made sense in isolation. Together, they spread the company's attention across too many different businesses at a time, when it needed to be focused on the single most important challenge of its existence, figuring out what it would look like when film was no longer the center of its business. By the early 1990s, the company had cycled through several CEOs who understood the digital threat intellectually but struggled to act on it. One of them, Kay Whitmore, who served as CEO from 1989 to 1993, became famous in technology circles for allegedly falling asleep during a meeting with Bill Gates, who was trying to discuss a software partnership. Whether or not that specific story is accurate, it became a symbol of Kodak's leadership posture during this period, aware that the world was changing, but not quite awake to the urgency of it. In 1993, the board made what looked like a bold move. They recruited George Fisher, the CEO of Motorola, to come run Kodak. Fisher was a genuine technology executive. He had led Motorola through the rise of mobile phones. He understood what it meant to have an industry change underneath you, and he came into Kodak with a clear diagnosis. The company had to commit to digital photography, not just experiment with it. And to his credit, Fisher invested. Kodak launched a series of digital products in the mid-1990s, including one of the first consumer digital cameras sold under a major brand name. By 2001, largely on the strength of Fisher's investments, Kodak was actually the best-selling digital camera brand in the United States. The company that invented digital photography was, for a brief moment, in 2001, the market leader in digital cameras. And yet, the digital camera business was nothing like the film business. The margins were thin. You made money once when someone bought the camera, and then that was largely it. There was no equivalent of the film roll, no recurring purchase that kept revenue flowing. Fisher was building a business that sold products at much lower margins than the one he was supposed to be replacing, and the film division, still hugely profitable, still employing tens of thousands of people, was watching this happen with deep discomfort. Inside Kodak, the tension between the film business and the digital business was not a background hum. It was a constant grinding conflict. The film division had the revenue, the headcount, and the organizational power. The digital teams had the future, but not the money or the political weight to go with it. Resources flowed to where the profits were, and the profits were in film, right up until the moment that they weren't. Fisher left in 1999. He had moved the company forward, but not fast enough and not far enough. The internal resistance had been too strong. In the early 2000s, something shifted that changed the equation entirely. It wasn't just the digital cameras were getting better and cheaper, it was that people stopped printing their photos. This might sound like a small thing, but it was enormous. Kodak's whole business model, the razor and the blade, depended on people printing. You take photos, you print photos, and Kodak makes money on the paper and the ink and the processing. Even as the company tried to build a digital camera business, it was counting on people continuing to print their digital images the way that they had always printed their film photos. And they didn't. They posted them online. They emailed them. They put them on a new website called Flickr. Later, they shared them on Facebook. The idea of printing a photo and putting it in an album started to feel like something your grandparents did. Kodak's response to this was to install a new CEO, Antonio Perez, who came from Hewlett-Packard's printer division, and make a major strategic bet, pivot the entire company to consumer printers. The logic was not crazy. If people were going to print their digital photos at home, Kodak could make money selling printers and ink. Perez believed Kodak could undercut HP and Canon on ink prices, which were famously expensive, and build a loyal customer base around affordable printing. The problem was the assumption underneath the strategy, that people were going to keep printing photos in significant numbers. They weren't. Smartphones and social media were about to make photo printing something people did occasionally, not routinely. The market Perez was betting on was shrinking while he was building toward it. Meanwhile, Kodak was hemorrhaging money. Film sales, which had peaked around 1999 and 2000, collapsed with stunning speed. In 2003, Kodak sold roughly 25 billion exposures worth of film. By 2010, that number had dropped by more than 90%. The business that had funded everything, the research, the factories, the buildings, the community programs, the pensions, they're all evaporating faster than any internal model had predicted. And Perez pursued the printer strategy aggressively and also worked to monetize Kodak's enormous patent portfolio. The company held thousands of patents related to digital imaging technology, many of them valuable. Kodak pursued licensing deals and lawsuits with Apple, HTC, Samsung, and others. It won some settlements, but patent licensing is not a growth business. It is a managed decline. The company cut workers, then cut more again. Rochester, the city that Kodak had built, felt it deeply. Entire supplier networks collapsed. Community programs that Kodak had funded for decades disappeared. The tax base that had supported local government shrank. By 2011, it was clear that no strategy was going to close the gap. Revenue was falling too fast, debt was too high, the runway was gone. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It listed assets of $5.1 billion and debts of $6.8 billion. The company that had employed 145,000 people at its peak had entered bankruptcy with about 17,000. By the time it emerged from bankruptcy in September 2013, it had roughly 8,500 employees. It sold off its consumer film, camera, and photo kiosk businesses. It sold most of its patent portfolio for $527 million, a fraction of what those patents arguably been worth a decade earlier. What came out the other side was a much smaller Kodak focused on commercial printing and packaging. It still exists today, but it bears little resemblance to the company George Eastman had built. Rochester never fully recovered. The population decline that had started in the 1970s accelerated. Thousands of people who had built careers and lives around Kodak found themselves looking for work in an economy that had been reshaped by the same technology shifts that had undone the company. Steve Sasson continued working at Kodak for many years after inventing the digital camera. He holds more than 20 patents, and in 2009, he and a colleague received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation from President Obama, one of the highest honors an American inventor can receive. He has spoken and written extensively about what it felt like to watch his invention change the world, while the company that employed him struggled to respond to it. He is not bitter. He is remarkably candid. George Fisher left Kodak in 1999 and served on several corporate boards. He has spoken openly in interviews about the frustration of trying to drive change inside a company whose existing business was so profitable that it resisted disruption from within. He recognized the problem clearly. He was not able to solve it fast enough. Antonio Perez led Kodak through its bankruptcy and the restructuring that followed. He retired in 2014. He's defended his printer strategy as a reasonable bet given what was known at the time and has argued that the speed of the film collapse made it impossible to restructure fast enough regardless of strategy. Kodak still exists as a commercial printing and packaging company headquartered in Rochester. It has a fraction of its former employees, none of its former cultural weight. It is publicly traded, but a small fraction of its peak value. Rochester, New York lost more than 60,000 Kodak jobs over the course of the company's decline. The city has worked for decades to reinvent itself around healthcare, education, and technology, with mixed results. It remains one of the most economically challenged mid-sized cities in the northeastern United States. Kodak did not fail because it missed digital photography. It invented digital photography. It failed because it could never bring itself to fully commit to a future that would require destroying the most profitable business it had ever built. Every attempt to go digital ran into the same wall. The film division had the money, the people, and the organizational power. Digital teams were underfunded, politically outgunned, and constantly asked to justify their existence against a business that was printing enormous profits every quarter. By the time film revenue started falling fast enough to make the urgency undeniable, the window for a clean transition had already closed. The result was a company that knew exactly what was coming, had a head start of more than 2 decades, held the key patents, briefly held the market lead in digital cameras, and still filed for bankruptcy. Not because of bad luck, because of a long series of decisions that consistently chose the comfort of today's profits over the survival requirements of tomorrow. So let's look at some of the key failures that we heard in this story. So failure number 1, they protected the product instead of the customer. Kodak's customers didn't care about film. They cared about capturing memories. Film was just the method. When a better method came along, customers were happy to switch. Kodak's leadership, however, thought of the company as being in the film business rather than the photography business. That framing made digital feel like a threat rather than an opportunity. If they had framed their mission as helping people capture and share moments, which is what they actually did for customers, digital would have looked like the next chapter, not the competition. Failure 2. They let the most profitable division set the strategy for the whole company. The film business was so profitable that it dominated every internal conversation. Budget meetings, resource allocation, executive attention, it all flowed toward film. Digital initiatives were treated as experiments that needed to justify themselves against a business producing 70% margins. When you let your most profitable division decide what gets funded, you're implicitly deciding that profitability today is more important than survival tomorrow. Failure 3. They had the right diagnosis but moved way too slowly on the prescription. George Fisher came into Kodak in 1993 knowing exactly what the problem was. He invested in digital. He launched products, he pushed the organization, and he still wasn't fast enough because the internal resistance was so embedded that every meaningful move required fighting for resources and approval from a culture that did not want to change. This is one of the most common patterns in organizational failure. Leadership that sees the problem clearly but underestimates how much energy it takes to actually change the direction of a large, profitable, entrenched organization. Seeing the problem is step 1. Building the organizational will to act on it fast enough to matter is a completely different and much harder challenge. And failure 4. When they finally pivoted, they picked the wrong direction. The printer strategy under Antonio Perez was a real strategy. It was not delusional. The logic that people would print their digital photos at home and Kodak would win the ink market was reasonable based on what the data said in the mid 2000s, but it depended on a consumer behavior trend that was already reversing by the time the strategy was being built. Social media and smartphones were making physical prints increasingly optional. Kodak bet on a market that was shrinking while they were building toward it. The lesson is not that Perez made a stupid bet. It's that when your core business is collapsing, the pressure to find a new one can lead you to grab the first plausible looking option rather than the right one. Taking the time to fully understand where the real opportunity lies, even when the pressure to act is enormous, is one of the hardest things a leadership team can do. Kodak had a 100-year head start, the most recognized brand in photography, and the team that literally invented the technology that disrupted it. It filed for bankruptcy in 2012 with 8,500 employees, down from a peak of 145,000. The film business that had made it one of the most profitable companies in the world collapsed faster than its leadership had modeled. The digital business it tried to build in its place never generated the margins needed to replace it. And the city it had built around itself paid a price that long outlasted the company's decline. So now that we understand the failures that Kodak had and what the history looked like, let's look at some lessons that we can take away from this whole situation Kodak faced. So lesson number 1, define your business by the problem you solve, not the product you sell. Kodak was in the memory capturing business. Film was one way to do that. When a better way came along, the customers moved. The company, which had defined itself as being in the film business, could not move with them. This applies to any manager or any team. Ask honestly, what problem does my product, my team, or my department actually solve for the people we serve? If the answer is tied to a specific method or tool rather than an outcome, you are more vulnerable than you think. The method will change. The problem usually doesn't. Build your identity around the problem, and you will be better positioned to adapt when the method changes. Lesson 2. Protect your innovation from your existing business. Kodak's digital teams were always competing for resources against the film division, and the film division almost always won because it had more revenue, more employees, and more political weight inside the organization. The practical solution to this problem is structural separation. When you are trying to build something genuinely new inside an existing organization, the new thing needs to be protected from the pressure of being measured against the old thing. Separate budgets, separate teams, different success metrics, different reporting structures if necessary. The new initiative will almost never look attractive compared to a mature, optimized business in the short term. If you put them in direct competition for the same resources, the new thing will lose, and you will have made a decision by inaction that you didn't consciously intend to make. For operations managers and general managers, this means being explicit about which parts of your team or department are running existing operations and which are building new ones. Don't ask both groups to operate by the same rules. They have fundamentally different jobs. Lesson 3. The speed of change in your market is not the same as the speed of change inside your organization, and the gap between them is your risk. Kodak's leaders understood by the early 1980s that digital photography was coming. They had studies, projections, internal reports, and they weren't blind. But understanding that change is coming and building an organization that can respond to it at the right speed are two very different things. Large, successful organizations move slowly. They have process, hierarchy, culture, and inertia built up over years. The market, especially in a technology shift, can move much faster. The gap between how fast the market is changing and how fast your organization can change is your actual risk, not the change itself. The practical lesson for managers: if you know a significant change is coming in your industry, your customer base, or your operating environment, start building the organizational capacity to respond now, not when the urgency is undeniable. By the time the urgency is undeniable, you are already behind. Fisher tried to accelerate Kodak in 1993. He needed to have started in 1985. Lesson 4. Be honest about whether your new strategy is chasing the future or chasing the nearest available exit. When Perez chose printers, it was because printers were a business Kodak could plausibly enter. It had brand recognition in the photography space, some relevant technology, and an incumbent competitor in HP that was charging high prices for ink. It looked like an opportunity. But the honest question was, is this where the real growth is, or is this just the closest thing we can find that isn't film? The answer, in retrospect, was the latter. Perez chose the nearest available pivot rather than stepping back far enough to ask where photography was actually going, which, by the mid 2000s, was clearly toward mobile, social sharing, and cloud storage. When you are under pressure to find a new direction for a product, a team, a department, resist the pull toward the nearest plausible option. Spend the extra time to ask whether you are actually solving for the future or just solving for the anxiety of the present. They feel the same in the moment. They produce very different outcomes over time. George Eastman built Kodak around a single idea that capturing a moment shouldn't require expertise. You press the button, we do the rest. That idea was right for over a century. It was right when the button was on a box camera loaded with film. It was right when the button was on a disposable camera you picked up at the drugstore. It is still right today. Every time someone takes a photo on a phone and automatically uploads it to the cloud. The idea survived, the company didn't, at least not in the form it had taken for most of its history. That gap between a good idea that endures and the organization built to deliver it is what this episode is really about. Kodak had every advantage: the brand, the patents, the engineers, the customer relationships. It had, in Steve Sasson, the man who literally built the future of photography with his own hands in a Kodak lab. What it didn't have was a leadership culture willing to bet the comfortable present against the uncertain future. And so it lost both. Thank you for listening to Mismanaged.